Hello, family heads, and welcome to another installment of Family Vacation, the show in between the series. I'm your host, Matt Glass, and today we're going to be talking about an album that I was really on the fence with for a little while. Not because of the music or the content or even the vocal performance, but rather the amount of things that I wanted to discuss, good and bad. Not to spoil it, but I actually am quite fond of this album with every single listen. However, there are a couple things about it that I feel I should articulate. To not beat around the bush any further, we're going to talk about the 2024 release Hotel Larut, a music project by Taiwanese-American singer-songwriter Joanna Wang. Released on May 7th of this year under Sony Music Entertainment through New Tokyo Terror Music, this is Wang's 12th studio album. The record discusses themes of love, empathy, horror, desolation, and interior struggles through the lens of 23 character vignettes. Though a majority of the tracks have silly titles, Wang wanted to encapsulate a sense of earnesty through observations of each of the characters' lives. This record was actually inspired by the classic comedy show The Kids in the Hall, and it was recorded over the course of 2 years. This absolute smorgasbord of an album is definitely a worthwhile listen. Now, family heads, one thing that I always like to look at whenever I review a new album, if it's me and AJ or just me, is whether or not the album cover matches what you're listening to. And holy shit, does it match. I feel like you jump into this album knowing exactly what you're gonna get into, at least like in terms of tone. But in terms of like genre, it's a whole different story. I'll elaborate as we go on, but let's get into this review, shall we? This record does a fair share of genre bending. It mainly stays in the areas of honky-tonk blues and folk, ska, but it veers into shoegaze and some noise rock, even a little bit of light jazz too. I also really like how on some of the tracks there's a bit of a 90s alt-rock influence with some really prominent sounding synths. You got horns, strings, guitar, bass, keys, etc. You want it, they got it on this record. Every single one of the tracks will take you to a different vibe from one to the other, sometimes even in the same track. The way this album is just able to keep going 100% and then stopping on a dime is impressive to say the least. There are a few track runs where you can tell 5 or 6 of the songs were done in one take. The way that you can have such a calm track and then dip into something way more chaotic like Flies is something to really marvel at. I also have to commend how creative each track is, as it paints a vivid picture based off of the sparse lyricism and the titles that are given on the track list. For example, I love the Scooby-Doo-like ska on Tina's House'u, the comedically calming jazz on You Lost Me at the Spanking Machine, and the frantic surf rock on Jump in the Water. With every single track, I really had no idea what I was expecting next, and I think this album's ability to leave you on your toes is really well done in parts, but we'll get to that in a moment. I'm going to switch up my usual category list and start talking about the vocal performance. I really like Joanna Wang's delivery. She has a really sweet and rich voice that actually really complements each track well. Despite it sounding very sweet, she's able to match the intensity of some of the more frenzy-inducing tracks. With an album like this that changes tone constantly, it's very good to be able to match with it. Each of the characters goes through kind of a ludicrous situation, so it's good that she's able to match with that and really set the vibe on each track. I love the vocal delivery on tracks like Pigeons on Your Balcony. She had a habit of meeting all the artists backstage, and he's giving us the freedom to do what's right. Whew. These are like Will Wood titles, let me tell you. These 3 tracks are pretty different, but very much show the velocity in which she's able to match. Despite each of the songs having different tones, sometimes very silly, it's good to know that you can tell she gives a shit, and really gives it her all. But let's dive into lyrics. As both me and AJ have mentioned before, neither of us are really good at picking up lyrics, and it usually takes us a bit longer to really process them. For me, it's because I usually just get so distracted by the instruments. Part of the reason why I was so hesitant to bring this album on here to discuss it further was because I really could not get past all the things happening in the music arrangements, which isn't necessarily a bad thing by itself. Each track on this record is actually just a piece in a giant cohesive story full of characters. The lyrics all across this album are pretty minimal, with each stanza being thoroughly repeated for about 2 or 3 lines. You see this on tracks like Shadow at My Feet, Contraband, The Beast, and actually a lot of other tracks, but these are the ones that stuck out to me the most. I think this was intentional so that the instruments can sort of carry most of the tracks and set the vibe. As each track plays out, the lyrics will move the story forward based off of observations or thought processes that each character has, which leaves room for the listener to piece together what's happening in the song itself based off of the music that they're hearing and the title. And none of the concepts are super complicated, but are in fact very intuitive when you get to hear the lyrics. Unfortunately, hearing the lyrics is actually the beginning of some of the negative aspects of this album. So let's talk about the album's production. Given the nature of how each of the tracks carry themselves in the overall theme, I understand why this album is produced the way it is, and why it's mixed the way it is. It obviously was a stylistic choice that keeps the listener primarily focused on what's going on, with the lyrics being more supplemental rather than the main focus. But I gotta be honest with you, as much as I do like the arrangements of the songs, I was getting very fatigued trying to listen to all the lyrics. Not only are all the instrumentals squeezed together in the same area in your audio periphery, but the lead vocals are also not even in the center of it. So I find that these lyrics and vocal stylings get absolutely buried in the mix. Examples of this are on tracks like She Had a Habit of Meeting Artists Backstage, He's Giving Us the Freedom to Do What's Right, and Jump in the Water. But more importantly, it actually happens right away on the first track and the title track, Hotel LaRut. I remember when starting the album from the beginning, I was kind of blown away by just how hard it was to hear the vocals. And while it didn't exactly ruin my experience listening to the album, I definitely would say it left a really lasting impression. The greatest comparison I could make is that listening to this album and trying to discern what's going on piece by piece is like trying to measure each drop in a boiling pot of water. It's just really hard, and there's so much happening and so much movement. Occasionally, you'll get some stray instruments in the far left or right channel, or even some ensemble vocals. I think this was trying to give it more depth to the mix for each track, but it really just made it even harder when I was trying to get a sense of what this album was actually about content-wise. Like I said before, I understand why they did this, but this production was really not my cup of tea. That being said, it didn't ruin the album, because I was able to find some catchy songs. Finally, here's what I had to say about album flow. Like I had kind of mentioned in the beginning, this album is a collection of short vignettes ranging from 2 to 4 minutes. Some of them are all instrumentals with some minor vocalizations, and others are lyric-filled. I think this album is definitely an adventure from start to finish, but with the amount of tracks that are on here, even if they are on the shorter side, it's really hard to keep track of them all. This album does genre flip quite a lot. However, it's doing it at such an alarming pace where sometimes I don't even know if I'm still listening to the same song or not. This, combined with me not being able to hear what's happening lyrically most of the time, while also having to get through 23 tracks, makes it a little bit of a slog to get through. My recommendation to a lot of listeners who are trying to do more of a casual listen is to not expect to add any of these songs to your playlist, because in the grand scheme of the album, these songs belong together. This is both somehow the album's strength and its weakness. I have tracks that I really enjoyed, but that's only after about 6 or 7 listens of this record. And unfortunately, with each listen, it does feel like I can feel all 53 minutes more and more each time. Overall, I think this album is definitely worth a listen. It is an experience that has some toe tappers setting the vibe through the album's entire duration. And I think there are going to be moments that everybody will be able to enjoy. This project was very ambitious, and the fact that she was able to make this sound so cohesive is truly something worth checking out. 23 individual tracks that sound like they were all recorded in one take is quite a remarkable feat. However, this is an album that a casual music listener might not enjoy, because musically, it definitely sounds like there's a lot going on, and jumping into the lyrics is definitely a whole other animal. I wanted to do a track by track for this like I do with all of my other reviews. For a little bit of background, family heads, whether or not me or AJ are recording an episode in the same place, I try to do a track by track so I can get thorough notes and give proper examples. And I gotta say, with all the tracks that were on this record, it was really hard. I could not put a lot of key differences on each track, which made me kind of realize that each track is only supposed to stand out from one another a little bit, but not so much where it takes away from all of it, because I think Joanna Wang really intended for everybody to listen to this in one fell swoop. And if you like stuff separately, like where you could add it on a different playlist, that's really, really cool. I definitely found a couple that I'm pretty fond of that I can sort of recall in my mind in particular. But If you don't worry. I think the album was designed this way, and I can respect it for that. My ranking is going to be a 6.6 out of 10, and I'm stuck somewhere between B- and C+. I definitely don't think it's going to make my album of the year, but it definitely will stand out in my mind. There is so much else that I want to say about this album in terms of its lyrical content and stuff and the story. I didn't really want to dive into lyrics too much because a lot of the lyric examples that I could have given you were direct things that happen in the songs. And since this is supposed to be like a cohesive story, I figured I'd save it. This is definitely an experience that everybody needs to listen to at some point. Well, family heads, hopefully you enjoyed this. Like I said, this album was very difficult to try and talk about, but I'm happy that I brought it here. I just didn't feel like it would have been right for me and AJ's usual episode regimen, but I also really felt like I couldn't go without talking about it because it's such a fascinating album. Let us know what other albums you want us to listen to, and yeah, thank you so much, family heads. As always, I'm Matt Glass, and AJ, you're on next week. Peace!